Hey, David.
Hey Ken, how you doing?
All right. Pretty good week, actually. How about you?
I'm sorry I couldn't hear.
I'm doing pretty good. A good week. How'd your week go?
Yeah, really well.
Good. I'm feeling like I actually was able to get to some projects this week, where last week I was just doing many,
Yeah.
many talks and meetings and whatnot. This week I actually got a little work done, so feeling good. Hi, Marika.
Hi. So I saw your shirt thing and I in Twitter and I had to go and change my shirt up quickly.
I know, I know that feeling. Yeah, I the only reason I noticed yesterday is, or when he said that, is because he really actually liked my shirt the first day, and he was really
Yeah.
enthusiastic about it. And then the second day, he did the same enthusiasm, but to mock me. I was like, oh my god, I got it. It just shows we're working hard, though, right?
Yeah. It exactly shows that. But it is kind of one of those good sides of working remotely that you don't have to care that much, although it's like, you know, when you start showing up with the same people too many times during the same week in the same shirt, then you have to kind of figure it out a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had I actually woke up early this morning and around 6 a.m. and took a shower and got ready, and then I had flashbacks to like back when I had a job that I walked to, actually commuted to. I was like, oh wow, I miss actually going to a job, but
I went to our office yesterday and I was like, it's not the big deal being in an office or not being in an office. And then was there and I felt so much in being at work.
mhm.
And it was like this funny feeling. And it actually did feel good. So I guess there's something with that. But yeah, it's still like you go through a much less makeup and a lot of other things when you don't have to go there.
Yes, the performance you have to do is much less, I think, when you're working
Yeah,
at home, or it's much more controlled. But
yeah,
I still like the rituals of, getting up and showering and wearing clothes like you're an important, or not important person, but at least you can be seen to the outside world and feel all right about yourself. But
yeah.
yeah, otherwise I get kind of down and depressed and start not feeling very happy.
Mm.
But
But it does feel like you're meeting a lot of people, even if you're actually not meeting that many people, when you are like spending all days in all these online calls. And we
yeah,
had a European Commission public and private sector workshop today, and with about 80 people, and it did feel like we were there. I mean, of course, there were all these Zoom problems and whatever, but it's pretty kind of um, intense doing all of that online. It's kind of you're missing those coffee breaks, but on the other hand, it's not that bad. So
yeah, the hallway engage interactions and seeing people definitely are nice.
yeah,
I do miss them, but I don't really miss the travel, like the big
yeah,
chunks
I
of
know,
time
I
where I'm
know.
not getting work done because I'm in an airport or in a
Yeah,
shuttle, or
yeah.
or
And
just tired.
we managed to have in that event, talking about open APIs, by the way, we had like kind of important head people from OAI there, and we had lots of practitioners, and we had public sector people from different countries and private sector people. So I mean, I'm sure that not everyone could have gone to physically to Helsinki to have that event. Uh, so in that sense, even if we had to wake up Alan Glickenhaus in the middle of the night to join in, it is still worth it.
Alan's
So
used to it. Alan's an old
yeah,
veteran.
Alan's
He
used to it.
knows.
Yeah,
So what was the focus of the conversation?
So it's European Commission is doing this API framework, and now it's going. The project is going towards the technical recommendations, and then there were all these, like, public sector, and especially the European public sector is full of all kinds of projects and programs about kind of frameworks or API catalogs and API design guidelines, and there are these e-delivery and X-road things where having security in terms of transferring the data around and connecting with APIs is important. So how to solve that in a kind of government set, but also so that the point of this event was to also learn from private sector and learn from like the best practices and not just go ahead and invent own. And there were actually, talking about the questions that we've been discussing here, there were so many kind of good bad questions about open API and specifications and what standards to use, and it was kind of like, if there is a standard about APIs, it was discussed today. So everything from like security to design and product and discovery things. And actually the one thing that came out of it that I think needs to go through to OAI is that there was this idea of kind of developing the product specification into open API, because that has been something that the API management vendors have been kind of having. Some of them, like for example IBM and stuff, they have had that kind of product specification there and the API specification, and that part was kind of missing. That was the discovery.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm fascinated by the conversations in Europe. I would say Europe is like having many conversations about the future of APIs, how to do this in government, how to do it right. And then here in the US, I mean, we were 2013 having these conversations, but we're just not anymore at those levels for various obvious reasons.
Yeah, but we weren't European.
Yeah.
Europe. I mean, I remember back in the days, I remember Finland and a few other places in Europe were having those discussions in like 2004, 5, 6.
Yeah.
But it was like in the age of service-oriented architecture and web services, and UDDI was a cool thing, and ontologies and that stuff. And it's kind of like, today I said that if somebody kind of had told me in 2006 or 7 the word ontology, I would have puked because I was so full of it by then. But seriously, that was kind of, the whole discussion was there, but then kind of REST came, and then Open API, Swagger, and everything else came, but that discussion stopped.
Yeah.
So it kind of, everybody was just so happy that we had web services and XML and everything, and that kind of was the limit of the public sector discussion.
Yeah.
Then this needs to be reborn, but luckily kind of it's being reborn right now, because I think that the standards are also much more kind of mature.
I think we're going to have to go back and learn from a lot of what happened in those earlier times. I mean, everyone's always, when I talk about Swagger or especially APIs JSON, people are like, oh, well, we already did that UDDI. And I'm like, yes, we did.
Yeah.
And let's keep doing it because it's important. And, so the whole backlash of SOAP always frustrates me. Because I was a SOA guy. That's what got me into APIs. So I don't want to throw it away and be anti, we got to learn from it.
No, I mean, it was very important phase, and we built some seriously good stuff then, even though we were literally a bunch of students in a basement, in a government basement, building it, and we had no idea, but there were these kind of pretty decent frameworks and pretty decent kind of blueprints of architecture principles when you just knew where to look for them. But if you build something, then there was a big kind of good chance that it still was handling time quite nicely. But now it's the time that you have to start doing something with it. Just one reason being that XML is not a good thing, or SAML is not the best thing anymore, or something like that, or you have these modern user interface frameworks and integration stuff that doesn't eat the old verb services anymore. So I think that's the main kind of reason where people have been starting to think about it. But that was also the kind of like it's not even if we talk about specs. The whole discussion today was around, is REST or GraphQL was a bit hazy for the folks there, but like is REST or this event driven stuff and asynchronous stuff, is that kind of the better way, or like MQTT and AMQP and all of that compared to REST? What should you use? And of course there's a clear answer depending on what you're doing, but kind of that was some of the levels of discussion. And then there were these kind of very high level, very advanced discussions on API discovery and catalogs and using a lot of good product design principles and behavior design principles in terms of doing the discovery. And it was a very interesting discussion. Let's
sounds like
put it this way.
Interesting. Yeah. It's good to hear that's going on. I mean, I've worked real hard to kind of export a lot of the energy around APIs 2013 to 2016 that was going on in the U.S. government. And, I worked with the European Commission and Lorenzino and team in 2017. So I, just saw their report come out. Yeah. So I'm happy y'all are leading and hopefully we'll keep leading as we kind of figure out our world. I think for us, and maybe David's got opinions on this, but I feel like each industry's got to kind of lead here. There's not a lot of federal leadership, so it's got to come from the banking. It's got to come from the healthcare sector.
Yeah.
And then maybe other sectors will follow suit and see the potential of reusable APIs and open tooling built around the specs. But I don't feel like we're going to get the government leadership in the next couple of years that we're going to need that you guys have. So.
Yeah, it can be a good and a bad thing, but as long as the government is not just leading but also listening, it's a good thing. And one thing I have to mention, this is my fork of the OpenAPI documentation repo, but just because this is now the pretty one, where I'm making merging these forks for the main one, but Javi has been doing this kind of documentation on OpenAPI and as part of the initiative work, and I've just been making it kind of pretty right now.
Yeah.
So. But now you went directly into the repo, so it's like the site is actually why you have some interesting. Yeah, it's supposed to. Oh yes, I shared the repo. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, it's not the front end.
It's not the front end. I picked the wrong URL. It has been a long day.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, it's like I stopped understanding clock times some hours ago. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the actual site.
That's the actual front end. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So this is the pretty stuff. Well, of course, the front page is still
nice.
Needing fine tuning, but.
Nice. Yeah, I'll look through this. This is good.
Yeah, I like the diagrams you put in there.
Yeah, I think Javi did a good job on that. I had to kind of do a little HTML, CSS, and other kinds of magic to get them working properly, but they were pretty decent. They're in the Open API specification explained under there. There are some pages with diagrams and bits shorter and understandable text. This particular page is maybe a bit longish. But anyway, I think that there's some good stuff and good examples, and definitely something that can be used properly. And
Nice. It's good to see. Yeah, no, I look forward to going through this. I just like one of my biggest frustrations is coming up with the Swagger docs when I'm looking for anything Open API. It just really frustrates me, and
yeah,
really want the OAI to dominate when it comes to all the content game.
mm,
Mhm.
It's good to see.
yeah,
So
and
does either the existing Open API doc or what you're putting together kind of have a good overview of how people use multiple documents and reusable components? I know it's easy to have reusable components within an Open API, but once you start spreading things across multiple
yeah,
documents, it gets really hard to manage at the development level. And
yeah.
then, when you go into production and stuff. And I was curious if there's any really good material around that management process.
Well, there's some stuff in this documentation about kind of reusing descriptions if you surf your way there.
Mhm.
I'm not entirely. I mean, it kind of is explaining at least part of it, because there's stuff about reference objects, and there's stuff about using kind of the because big part of it is the response and request stuff, and the kind of data model and things about reusability. But then there are these different levels of it, but I haven't seen any other explanation really about it except this one. So I mean, no, not wrong. Seriously, my keyboard is not doing what I wanted to do right now. Sorry, reusing descriptions. That was what I wanted to copy paste there. Yes. So that page.
So just the components object and reusing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there
So
we go.
this is not a full answer, but this is a answer.
Hey Dave, I really I haven't seen many good examples of it in the wild. Like I saw GitHub when they released theirs, it was all separated into separate files. But then they rehydrated it, and now they're just one file. And I really think the lack of tooling support is probably the biggest blocker for people, because it's just like you said.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like what we do is we've got over 25 different APIs in our platform. And the only level that we do reuse is at the schema level, but we don't even do it by referencing schemas inside the other Open API documents. What we do instead is when we process a document, we publish the schemas out to a web server.
Mm-hmm.
And then we publish them as JSON schemas too, so they can be reused by other things. And they're not constrained by having them being embedded inside of an Open API doc. So they stand alone as independent documents, and then all of our APIs reference those schemas from the central schema server. And then we have internal like integration servers that we use for development, and then we've got public servers where when we publish things out for the public, we have to push the schemas out there as well. So our public Open APIs refer to schemas on our public server. During development, they all refer to things inside of our firewall, which makes it really hard to use things like swagger.io or other tools. So it's a disadvantage of that particular method. But
I totally know what you mean, and that's actually, like, if I've been a bit on the RAML side of things sometimes, but that's exactly the thing that because I'm going to expose a dirty secret. This is like from the first ever API that I was designing, or like the second version of it, and and the guys in the team have been updating it, but this is like from that, and you can see that there are these RAML files, and then there are the sample and schema files. And this is exactly the point, that we could kind of keep them as a separate thing, because then we were using them in tests, and we were using them in a lot of different things, and really doing validation with them. And it's really hard to do if you don't have kind of them as a separate thing. Yeah. And that's, I'm kind of hoping that this 3.1.0 will kind of do something for it, and using those.
Yeah, I haven't seen a whole lot there, but so like we version our schemas as well. So every time we change a schema, we change that schema's version, and that schema version is part of the schema URL. So,
and that's independent of the Open API. That's just
independent of the Open API. Yeah. But if I change the schema version, I'll also update the API version.
Because I have to.
But that way, other APIs can refer to those schemas, and then that way, the schemas, if they haven't changed, when I update an Open API, I go from version 1.5 to 1.6. If the schema hasn't changed, no one has to change a URL to get to that. They can refer to the original schema that they want. So
we've updated the importer with Postman to work with multiple files and be able to import them. But now I'm working on the proposals for, how do we do reuse? So how do we allow, you bring in and it goes, well, all of these things are in line. How do we componentize any of the parameters, the headers, and put them into the components object and replace them with refs? So, and then is there a reverse of that? Can we then pull things out of components and hydrate in line? But then there's outside of docs. How do you do that across? Can we centralize? So I have in a lot of my workspaces, I'll have a bunch of open APIs, and then I have one open API that all it is just a components. It doesn't have any paths, and that's where I centralize components across files, and that's kind of becomes my design toolbox with common patterns that I use. And I'm trying to figure out how to bring that out into the interface, so it's just drag and drop. So now I can go, well, I need these headers, I need these, and then it just drags the references. But man, that's cumbersome, and if you don't fully get what's going on, so the tooling has to support us in this.
Right, and the tools aren't quite there yet, because it's very difficult. And it's one of the things that I'm not too fond of with Open API is that they rely too much on the JSON ref notation. It's embedded and required in order to use Open API, and so it's fine at the JSON schema level to have refs and things like that, but once you get into the document, it's just more cumbersome to have to use ref objects to reference things. There's just too much Chrome that kind of gets in the way. It obscures the intent. It'd be nicer for the tools to be able to kind of hide that, to make it look like here's a ref, and like you're saying, either hydrate it or show it in line. I don't really want to see the ref.
I mean, like the inline
approach. I want to look at the API and not see a ref there. I want to see the inline thing. Even though under the covers it might be a ref.
But that's exactly. I mean, like we come back down to the. I loved Anypoint platform, the first versions that Mills put in with the RAML and stuff, because it was exactly doing it like that. Even if you have these different files for the schema and sample, it was exactly showing it as if you were kind of working with one file, and that was kind of super great, because it is really, I mean, it makes it look much more difficult than it is looking at the ref stuff there, because you have to then start kind of in your mind looping it and seeing like, okay, where is this? And then you get lost, and then especially in the Swagger layer, is like you scroll down and up and down and up, and then you kind of forget where the hell you were with it, and you miss like, was this endpoint or what? It's very complex.
Well, in the schema portion, like what Dave was talking about, how he pulls out the schema separately, I think that that's critical for just a literacy point. Like, I don't know how many teams I worked with that didn't realize that was JSON schema in the Open API. They're like, and Fran mentioned this a couple times, that he supports a lot of JSON schema questions because people are hitting their forms asking about async. They don't realize it's JSON schema.
No, they don't, and because most developers are never exposed to the idea of JSON schema, you know, at school, because it's irrelevant thing for all the other purposes of coding, it seems. But with APIs, it would be really crucial, but it's missing.
Yeah.
Right. And it's important for us to keep the schemas separate from the Open API, because we'll have schemas that we use for other tools, which we might want to share schemas between Open API and Async API.
Yeah.
Or we might want to put schemas that we use in our audit tool and things like that, which are all unrelated, but by using schemas just as JSON schemas, you can use all these JSON schema tools without having to drag in the structure of an Open API document and having them be embedded inside the components/schemas. They're all extracted out and independent of that. So that gives us some flexibility.
I saw the Kubernetes team did the same thing. There was an actual page where it's like, I'm tired of pulling these out of the Open API for Kubernetes. Here's a list of all the JSON schema. And they did the same thing. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. What we do with our pipeline is, so the Open API documents all have references to external schemas via web servers and stuff. But then we have another tool within our pipeline that resolves all those schemas and gives you a standalone Open API document that has no external references in it. So everything gets embedded in. And then we use that for our code generation and other things. So we have other tools that don't have to worry about resolving external refs and things like that. Everything gets done for us in our pipeline.
See, I feel like this is another dimension of we had this conversation with Fran a couple times now, is he's pretty adamant that they should own the parser and the generator and the docs, that he considers them core tooling to the spec, that the spec org should own that. And that's, at odds with the OAI, which is like, we don't do tooling. And I feel like the parser, the generator, and then a path resolver and hydrator and dehydrator should be part of that core tooling. And then maybe, the OAI should look at something when it comes to overlays or even this core spec, is how do you do kind of a TTL for this? Like, this is just a cache representation of the Open API. So when some tooling opens it up, it knows that this is a hydrated, temporary use. It's not the actual core spec. The core spec is over here. If you want to pull the latest, and then this one expires in X amount of time or something like that. So, yeah, lots to think about there.
Yep. There was actually, I'm on the JSON schema Slack.
Yeah.
And Ben Sutton posted something on there yesterday that I retweeted, basically. Let me see if I can find out what he...
I need to get on that Slack. Writing a note down for myself.
Yeah. So what he wrote was, someone was asking about how you model inheritance in JSON schema. And he wrote back, says, there is no standard way to express inheritance. JSON schema isn't built for code generation. And really, I think that's a critical point that people don't really grasp, is JSON schema is written for validation.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's written to validate an existing document. It's not a modeling language.
Yeah.
We use it as a modeling language in Open API, but it's a couple degrees removed from what you're really trying to do. And so you have to use all these tricks of using all of and other schema composition things to represent what you really want. Your intent is something like inheritance. I've got this object, and then here's another object that has all the fields of that object. It extends it and adds new properties.
Yeah.
You can
also
make it in JSON schema, but it's really not the same thing. And especially with JSON schema, you can do all kinds of weird things to validate that are very, very difficult if you won't turn it into code generation. You can express things in JSON schema, that you don't have good representations in a lot of target programming languages that don't have multiple inheritance, or that have really obscure ways of doing things like interface inheritance and things. So it gets really tricky if you really use JSON schema without understanding the constraints that code generation bring in. But Ben went on to talk about that, with JSON schema vocabularies, there are ways to give directives to code generation if you want to express something like inheritance. There would be ways to do that with vocabularies, and I have no idea how that's done because I'm not at all familiar with how vocabularies are in JSON schema. But I think that's a really interesting topic to explore and find out how OpenAPI can evolve and use vocabularies or something to give better guidance and use of schemas in OpenAPI that can really help with code generation and other things.
Well, actually, there are two topics for that. First of all, we kind of had that in one of the two TSC meetings where I've been in the OAI, was that about the schema things or like the data modeling and schema support and stuff. And if I understood correctly, there wasn't a very big enthusiasm to go kind of there with the OpenAPI spec because it was considered to be more like kind of a data modeling thing, which is kind of outside of the scope. But then the other thing is that what I've seen this kind of inheritance thing and also the problem of, if then conditions and kind of conditional stuff. And usually for me, it has been a sign of a poor kind of modeling of the purposes of what is supposed to be done with that API and endpoint, because not in all cases, obviously, there are cases where that is valid, but a lot of times developers start thinking about that and seeing it as a problem when they should actually kind of think about that these are two different use cases. And this is why I'm kind of getting into this if then else conditional stuff, for example, or for example, the inheritance is a real problem, obviously, in some cases, and kind of this, now my English is kind of getting lost to me, but this kind of recursive stuff. So that's always an issue, but it's also a question of what that API is going to be used for, because in a lot of UI related cases, and even integration related cases, it's going to be a huge problem if you design the data model like that. These are kind of like...
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, just go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I think these are just classic problems of where you come at from, the to solve the problem. And this is one of the things that RAML, when I talked to them I guess it's a month or so ago, they're like, what's the future of RAML? And they're like, well, 2.0, we're going to do 2.0. And I'm like, well, how does that size up against what your support of the OAI? And they're like, well, RAML's a modeling language first and foremost. And, and so I really see people, when they define their APIs, most of the open APIs are Swaggers, it's predominantly Swagger. They don't have schemas associated with. Most people come at it, I'm defining paths, and I'm not really worried about the actual schemas or the model, or they come at it purely from a database standpoint, and they're like, oh, this is my schema, this is my database schema, and it's got to translate into that representation of REST, and they don't get what REST is all about and for. And so it's just a mixed mud, people trying to figure it out. And I don't know. I think we got to have some better examples of how to demonstrate it to people, like what are good healthy patterns and how to model and deal with that kind of inheritance and all of that. Well, we didn't even do the formalities in this one. We just got diving right in. This is good. What else we got on the table? This is interesting. Your API, your first RAML one. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's
this is we started this that API 2014. or something like that. We had an API like 2009, but it was remotely REST-ish. Yeah. We modeled it with a Flickr API, but this was after a lot of research, like serious. We had guys writing theses about this stuff. I literally had a group of like students and researchers doing stuff before we came after this, and we did all these interviews with all the partners and customers and things like that, and then we came up with it. And the reason why the versioning is 1.5 is that I got so fed up with people asking, when is it ready? When is it ready? Like we were doing the second version. And I said, well, it's never going to be ready. It's like going to be ready when we call it version 2. But I told them that it's not going to happen. And now it's still 1.5 because it's still backward compatible to that API that was born in 2014.
That perspective of doneness that people want and expect, but APIs can't, the number of organizations I go into and like, we're done with our API. We did it. We checked that box. It's like, no, like you're never done with your APIs. What are you talking about?
Hey, but the project has ended and the budget has been used. Yes. So yes. We're done.
So I guess for video, for people who tuned into this, this is just our weekly regular API specification toolbox conversation that we're driving from the GitHub here. And usually when we kick off, I'm always like, hey, what are people working on? But we just kind of dove right into that naturally, I think, this time, and just got talking about what's going on in Europe and then specifically into modeling and schema. So I would like to keep, I want to get Ben to the table to have some conversations. But I can give some updates on some of the stuff I've been working on, which I've updated the page. So I've got all the last office hours up here. I was, I think, a week behind on that. But I started recording last week. I did, Maruka and I did a conversation after last week's call, and I've got that published here. I haven't done any storytelling around it or getting the word out, so I'm gonna start doing that. This week I also did one with Fran on Wednesday. And this is just, casual conversations. There's not a lot of production or quality around them, as you'll see. But I thought our conversation was interesting, and I want to keep, once I do want a conversation with someone, I want to keep repeating that and bringing it back in. Has she done anything bad? Is she good? Okay. Sorry, my dog has been digging in the planters on the deck, and she's being good this morning, though. And so I want to keep doing these conversations. I'm going to keep bringing in. I'd like to get Ben from JSON Schema. I'm going to loop in Daryl. I'm going to loop in just as many people as I can. And then I want to keep coming back and bring in, and so we can rehash conversations, but always keeping it about the specifications and the wider space. So I'll keep ramping up the storytelling around those. One thing that I'm doing because this is how, having this line in the sand for this meeting each week forces me to do a certain amount of work each week on this. And that's one of the main reasons I'm doing this, because this is, even though, it's only usually 4 or 5 of us who show up, or today it's just the 2 of us, I'm perfectly happy because it's I get to talk to you guys, and I get it before this, I'm I got to do some work before, otherwise I'll look silly. And one of those things I'm doing is I'm going to start picking up this newsletter project. I'm going to move it forward. And all I'm going to do for a newsletter is this is going to be weekly, and it's going to have, I'm going to pick one of the specs and highlight a part of it and talk about a part of it. I'm going to highlight an API provider who is using one of the specs. And then I'm going to, because my open source tooling, and I didn't do any work this week on the service providers that I want to pick one service provider that I'm going to write a good description about, do a story and include it in the newsletter. And I'm going to pick one open source tool and do the same thing. And so having this newsletter line in the sand, where'd my screen go? Helps me do that work, make sure I go, okay, I'm gonna showcase one service provider, one tool, and one API provider, and that'll help me do some work. And then the other is I'm going to answer at least one question, and I'm still playing with the format for how I answer questions. See if I have any. I think I did one this week, and I'm pushing forward. Oh yeah, it was this one. It was, why should I use OpenAPI for my APIs? And I'm playing with, I don't like speaking. I don't really want it to be centered around me. So I started playing around with just how to use captions. I really don't like what I have in this one, but I'm playing with zooming in onto specific areas of the spec and then using captions to kind of describe what's going on. But as you can see, I'm still getting good, getting my bearings when it comes to the captions. So I'm going to keep working on that, answering some questions, and then I'm going to highlight whatever one of the latest conversations are. So this will just be a simple HTML. Each newsletter will be an issue off of here, and all its purpose is for me to basically do this amount of work. This is like my measurement for the amount of work that I'll do each week to kind of research and profile the space. So that's kind of my contribution for what's going on from this week. What else? I know I had something else. Let me see. I think that was the bulk of it. I did do, we launched this week, which is the U.S. Election Resource Center, and it's I think I showed it the week before, but it's a list of APIs for census and a couple others, FEC, and it's got some visualizations, but it's got like voting data. But this is a project that I'm doing at Postman, and so, but this is all APIs JSON driven, which I showed a little bit the other week, and so so I'm going to keep doing these toolboxes, and I'm actually doing one for the entire U.S. federal government. Each agency is going to have its toolbox because I have a lot of data about government APIs, and so one of the things we're doing at Postman is Postman wants to kind of tap my experience in this area and become more of a data API platform. And so I'm going to be doing this work to try to kind of flesh out APIs for the federal government, and Census was the first one that we're kind of targeting for that. So Census will get its own developer toolbox or resource center, and then it'll list out all of the APIs there, and then I'll do one for like NOAA and commerce and all of that. So these toolboxes are just machine readable and APIs JSON, and they live on GitHub, so they can be forkable. But anyways, I'll share more work there as we're doing it. So I think that was all the updates I had. If you guys have suggestions for people who want to have conversations, API conversations, one, invite them to this group, but send them my way. Happy to talk to them and get people thinking about APIs.
Hey guys, this is Dave. Dave Nielsen, just joined a little late.
Hey Dave, how you doing?
Hi Dave.
Hey, pretty good. I had an overlap call with folks from India, but hey, I wanted to let you know that I did a little investigating into Hypertrace and how we're using OpenAPI, and I found out that right now we really only have one API exposed, and but it is technically in OpenAPI format. They actually use OpenAPI inside of Traceable, our SaaS product, to all of the ingested data that we collect from traces. We actually turn them into OpenAPI standard format. Nice. Yeah, I didn't even know we were doing that, but everything gets translated into the OpenAPI format. Someday I hope to expose that back to folks and let them know, like, hey, you're using here's how OpenAPI you are. But nothing like that right now. But the question that came up was, the one API that we're exposing in our open source project, Hypertrace, is actually exposing a GraphQL query.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a lot of different parameters, and so I think it's like technically it becomes this like monstrous spec.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you've had any because that seems like that'd be a very popular issue or challenge for people. I was wondering if you've run across that.
I mean, in my experience, yeah. I mean, the GraphQL to OpenAPI kind of competition, as well as I would say overlap, is pretty common. And the schema definition for GraphQL is pretty commonly and famously verbose in my experience. And that's what people like, because they have access to that full schema. They can, define from that, derive from that exactly what they want. And they're not constrained by a designed API or that would be described as an open API. So yeah, there's not a lot you can do with open API to fix that. That's really just kind of a trait of GraphQL. My experience is that's the way it is. That's, you're exposing the full schema, the full surface area as a GraphQL schema document, and that's what people want. So that's not a negative. That's a positive, I guess.
Yeah, so that's the way we've done it. It is an open API. It's monstrous, I guess. Well, that's the feedback I got. Yeah. So I think that's a positive, I guess. It's a trade-off to have more in it, but as long as it's machine readable and all that, I guess it works.
Yeah. Go ahead, Marika.
Yeah. I was just thinking that I'm not entirely convinced what's the kind of point with open API and GraphQL, other than if you have an API management tool or some other tool where you kind of want to describe the APIs and have them listed and kind of have some kind of control over them, like at least on a very kind of loose level. And maybe then it's a point. But with GraphQL, the whole kind of how it's documented and how you understand what to do with it's kind of a totally different game. It has its own tooling and seriously, the only reason I've ever even considered that GraphQL should be open API documented or compatible is because of API management tools, really.
Yeah.
But if somebody has a better idea, I'm happy to hear.
I mean, I don't think there should be we should minimize the overlap between them. I really think GraphQL is like, here's the entire schema, like the schema definition for GraphQL. Here you go. Here's the entire surface area, understand it, use it. But, and I'm working on this with GitHub. I'm trying to get them on board with a GraphQL and OpenAPI series where they live in harmony and work together, and you choose one or the other. It's not, and for different purposes. Like if you want, if you want complete control over GitHub, you go for the GraphQL schema. If you know it, if you're in tune with it, and you want full control. But if you don't know it and you need to kind of be spoon-fed and understand, and you just want one part and one piece, and you don't want to have to actually define that part and piece. You want it defined and spoon-fed to you. Then the Open API or the REST API is where you should go, and stop trying to go, okay, well, here's an Open API for the GraphQL, because you can describe it. It's just, it always feels like to me like, round peg, square hole, and it's just not the same. Like let's acknowledge the differences and acknowledge that they have different purposes, and they happen to share HTTP, and they happen to share something, so you can translate between the two. But I think they have just different distinct purposes and values. But
that makes sense to me. It really reminds me of the difference between like a document store versus a SQL database.
Yeah.
And they're so similar, because when you're using Mongo or something like that, one of the main reasons why you use it is you're rapidly iterating, you're building something new, and the last thing you want to do is keep thrashing back and forth with some SQL table and fields and all that kind of stuff, especially if you're collaborating with others. It just becomes like collaboration nightmare. Breaking things is fine in the beginning when you're just building the app. It seems very similar. And so maybe like with GraphQL, one of the benefits of it is similar. Like, here's what we got. You do what you want. But over time, it might make sense to start figuring out like, oh, well, here's a pattern that we're using with APR that should be more of a spoon-fed API. Let's make that into something that's easily consumable.
And that's the part that I find GraphQL believers when they're like, oh, this will work for everything. Everybody should use this. And I'm like, great, I get that. I'm a database guy. I love GraphQL, but not everyone understands your schema. Not everyone understands it, and to be just dropped into that and have to be able to write your own SQL queries or your own queries is daunting. And that given a path, here you go, and just laying that path for people in a restful way is, I think, super valuable to new users, people who don't necessarily understand. But it is definitely a restrictive thing for people who are in the know and just get out of my way. Give me what I need. Let me craft exactly what I want.
And also for the user interface, it's fine, especially if you are the one like in charge of the whole user interface, and you will get deep dived into it. But if you just want to have like one purpose or few or do an integration or something like that, then it's a nightmare. But actually, I think that in this case, for example, OpenAPI has that advantage that if you have any kind of cataloging or kind of you're doing API management, you are having some kind of a list of APIs. For example, Dave, your kind of problem that not knowing if your product has an API or not is a very typical kind of product manager problem. A lot of times the non-coders need to know if there is an API or not, and if there are REST APIs and there are kind of GraphQL APIs and there are all kinds of different APIs, then it might be that even if there are kind of for that purpose models with OpenAPI, to some extent, it might be a better thing. But of course, if it's a big bloat and if it isn't human readable at all, even when generated into a documentation, then it might be a problem that could be solved in another way.
Dave's world for me is super interesting because one, the interface of traceable of the tool, like what you do. Here's the entire schema surface area. Here's a GraphQL query. Do it. That makes a lot of sense. I would say the mapping of requests from a traceability, like here's all the traffic in the request, and we're generating an open API for each one. Kind of, basically using open API like it's a HAR file, and saying here's each of the transactions, but here, the path, the query, the headers, the payload, the response to request, all as a single contained unit. That makes a lot of sense, and you can kind of gather those up. And I see a lot of companies emerging to do that right now as a kind of, automated discovery, mapping the chaos of what's going on and then connecting the dots. But if you were to then publish, like say, okay, here's the whole surface area of all of the requests and responses going through, and then publish a graph of that, of all of those queries and objects, that'd be near impossible to do, because it's, I guess you could do it. I guess you could map it all out and throw a GraphQL instance over the front of it, but that would be a pretty interesting and daunting challenge. But I think these are just highlights the strengths of each of them and the weaknesses of each of them, and that GraphQL for the surface area of traceable as a tool, here's what you can do it, run with it, versus, your operations, all that's being vacuumed up, all the requests that traceable is hoovering up and mapping. That makes sense to have those as individual open APIs, because then you can start stitching them together in different ways or not. It's just, I think, an interesting challenge.
Yeah, not to go too deep into that, but we are actually with Hypertrace. What we try to do is every API that's been just every API that's been traced, that has a distributed tracing library, we can take all of those and automatically stitch them together into services and give you, and then and we actually do put the graph together of like what's calling what. We kind of build the Death Star diagram for you.
Nice.
Yeah, we actually are able to do that. We use our own algorithm to figure out what APIs are part of the same service. It's not that hard, but I don't know if too many people are doing that. But you just mentioned that you saw a lot of folks who were doing something similar to that, like automated discovery, mapping chaos, connecting the dots, I think, or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Maybe there are a lot of others doing it. I'd like to know who they are, actually. I like to kind of view them as my competition, I guess.
Well, I wouldn't say they're directly your competition, but yeah, they are. I would say the many different reasons why people are mapping that landscape would define whether they're competition or not. But so I mean, use Optic is one. Aiden, if you want to ever talk to Aiden, they're doing it from a diff. They're doing diffs against all of that. So they're auto-generating open APIs, and they're giving you the ability to then accumulate that into one master truth of what this is, and then do the diffs and version control on all of that, and then publish docs or do testing on that. Working with Teach Labs, who's doing it, but they're doing it from a vulnerability standpoint, and they're trying to kind of go, okay, well, here's all the requests that are being made. These are being made with these client tooling and these codes, and they have these vulnerabilities in them. And then you have people who are doing it from a security vantage point that are doing it and going, okay, here's all of your surface area. We've tested them and scanned them. You didn't tell us what your surface area is. We hoovered up, vacuumed up all the parts and pieces, and we've discovered your surface area, and we're going to help you secure it now. There's like 3 or 4 providers doing that. I know Ping is doing something like that. White Hat Security is doing something like that. And then you guys are very much coming at it from a traceability, like, all right, let's map this landscape so that we can understand the complexity of different calls being made and what's going on. And then that's awesome that you guys are creating that Death Star map. I think that's hugely needed, because visibility and observability, people don't know their infrastructure. So I mean, and I can keep going. There's other different reasons why. I mean, Postman has Interceptor, which we can intercept, and we have a proxy, and then we'll generate collections from that, and then that's more of a Swiss Army knife. Like, you've got to have a reason why you're doing that. We don't have a reason. We just do it for you. And so it's an interesting landscape. I love what you guys are doing.
I have to add to that there are these kind of visualizing the architecture tools. They've been around, a few of them, even one Finnish one that is selling hugely to US, but I can't remember for the life of the name right now. But there are quite a lot of that kind of visualization stuff going on, but not exactly necessarily fully runtime. So obviously that would be a thing, and that was actually just recently asked about in Twitter, if there is any. But then the use optic was actually mentioned. Like, we were just having a discussion with Tyler Dave, by the way, and he'd been talking with Matt, and use optic came to the discussion because actually the kind of compliance, or like the runtime compliance to the spec stuff, is also what they're doing, and there's open source stuff in it, and it's kind of like, it's a proxy, like kind of UR, so it could be an interesting thing to kind of do a use optic plugin to Hypertrace, for example, or something like that.
Interesting. Okay.
It might be a good idea.
Okay, cool. Yeah, those are the kind of, it's over the years you realize that all these potential competitors, most of them turn out to be good partners.
Yeah, I would reach out. I mean, if you want an introduction to Aiden at Use Optic, he'd love to talk to you, and he'll be totally no bullshit about how he sees you being a competitor or not. So, those are, I just see it as great minds think alike, and you guys are doing amazing things, and there's happens to be other amazing people doing similar things just for different incentives and reasons. So.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, even my fiercest competitors have usually end up being my friends in some way. It's to me, it's like you're all sitting around at a poker table and playing a fun game, right? You don't show your buddies your cards, but you talk and you share ideas and have a good time.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and most of the time you have a common enemy or customers. And the more new kind of the more trendy stuff and cool stuff you're doing, the more the whole industry needs to kind of educate the customers that they also understand how cool things you're all doing. So
that's true. Sort of, yeah, a shared challenge. Education is always a shared challenge. Yeah. So yeah, no, actually, absolutely, introduction would be great. I'm just starting to get to the point where we can finally start talking about Hypertrace more actively, because we've been trying to make it consumable. It was too complicated to download and install. We put a lot of effort into creating a Docker Compose version, which we're going through final pre-beta testing, and then we'll release it to the public in a more formal way, so that we can start getting more like random user feedback. And Marjuka definitely will be reaching out to you in the next day or two on that.
Okay, good, because actually that is like good news, because Tessa and I spent a lot of interesting hours, and especially Tessa, trying to kind of figure out the installation, because it was a multi-part exercise before.
Yeah. It's what happens when you take a large SaaS project, which nobody ever thought to, deploy concisely, and then all of a sudden try to make it something you can easily download and run on your laptop. It's like I forget exactly, but it was like 16 services.
Yeah, it's kind of like works on my machine problem.
Yeah.
When you start having that many things and you start having compatibility issues, and we also had this, but I forgot.
Yes, exactly. So we've, I will not claim that everything's perfect yet. We still have 6 containers, but that's a far better situation than like the 15 or 16 we had. Yeah, it's a night and day situation right now. So anyway, that's where I'm focused, and all these tools, as you can imagine, a lot of these tools we just mentioned, Open API will become, if not already, very important for them, because manually entering all this stuff is just impossible.
Yeah. Well, good to see.
We're going to drop. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks, David. Have a good one.
Thanks, David.
All right. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Yeah, I got to go too. I got a call here coming up. But thanks, you guys. I look forward to hearing more about telling that story, David, when you guys are ready. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, thanks. You likewise. I enjoy this, even though I didn't make much of it today. I always enjoy jumping in here and hearing what's going on. So we'll see you next week.
Cool. Bye.
Thanks, Marika.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Bye bye.